Good afternoon. Welcome to Talent and Growth. Thank you very much for tuning in live. If you've picked us over the blazing sunshine, if like many, you're catching up on the podcast, thank you for tuning in as well. Today, we are talking attracting, retaining and supporting neurodivergent talent. So really important topic for lots of reasons, and something which I always feel that I want to learn more about, so I can be better at my job and better at working with the people I work with. So I'd like to introduce our two guests, or get them to introduce themselves rather. So, Parol, welcome back to Talent and Growth. Do you mind just giving us a quick intro to who you are, what you do, and also just a little bit about why this topic is so important to you?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me back, Paul. So I'm Parol. My title is Recruitment Marketing Partner and Neurodiversity Advocate at X Design, but I am an ex-tech recruiter. I spent about 5 years between agency and internal. So my job is focused around like employer branding, which kind of like does tie into this topic as well, as we talk about attracting neurodivergent talent. But my role as neurodiversity advocate, which is kind of like, it's what people call like an ERG lead type of thing in like most organizations. So the reason that I decided to do that is I got an ADHD diagnosis just over 2 years ago. It meant that I had to unlearn and relearn a lot of things about myself as well. And I've learned a lot about navigating the workplace and also an interview process for the first time myself, actually, about like a year and a half ago as well. And I also mentor a lot of people who are neurodivergent. So I'm like really passionate about helping lower the barriers to employment, helping them get the support that they need as well, and raising awareness about important topics within this. So that's me. Thank you so much for having me.
And how are you tackling the heat today, Parol? Do share.
Well, I have got, I don't know if people can see my hair very subtly blowing in the wind. This is not like a L'Oreal advert attempt or anything. So I don't actually have a big fan. So I've got this little portable fan, but here's the cool thing. If you press and hold it, it has a very fine water mist. So it makes your face really cold. I think it's basically how like air conditioning works. So that's what I'm doing. And of course, got a little Diet Coke as well.
Love it. I think it reminds me of a 90s pop video. So love that with the hair blowing. Yeah, I'm actually in a little box room today, which is, there is no aircon in here. It's incredibly hot, so I'm going to be melting as we go. But there we go. Beth, same to you. Intro, please. Who you are, what you do, and why this topic is important to yourself.
Absolutely. Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Parol. So my name is Beth. I am the head of people for a fintech organisation called Everything Financial. I've been with the organisation a little over a year, and my background in financial services, but HR specifically, has been broadly around sourcing talent and learning and development programs. So I've had a big focus on early talent and recruiting into, for example, apprenticeship programs, degree programs, and also working alongside education institutions as well. So I've been a school governor and a member of a trustee on a school board as well. And similar to Parol's journey, actually, I had an ADHD diagnosis about 2 years ago as well. I don't know if lockdown was your trigger, but it was definitely mine. So I'm also on a similar journey of kind of incorporating my neurodiversity into myself, my professional kind of identity, and relearning and accepting some things about myself that used to have negative words, and I now realise are just part of my neurology. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Beth. And talking of words, I think a good place to start might be just kind of breaking down some of the terms, because many people will have heard these terms but might not understand exactly what each one means, and I think it's good to just clarify that. So Beth, if I stick with you, if you talk some of these terms, what we mean by neurodiverse, neurodivergent, neurotypical, do you mind just breaking these down for us?
Of course, yeah. So neurodiversity generally means that around about 1 in 5 of the population has a different neurology, so a notably different structure to their brain, which results in notably different ways of interacting with the world or experiencing the world. And that covers a really broad spectrum. So the most obvious ones are that people are probably used to is autism and autism spectrum disorder, but also ADHD, as we know. That would also include dyspraxia, dyslexia, and some of the more unusual ones. So my partner is a synesthete, so he hears colours. This is one of his original paintings behind me. So, and it's a painting of a sound. So there are lots of different various types of neurodiversity, and about 1 in 5 people around planet are neurodiverse.
Can you just, I've not actually heard of that before in terms of hearing sound. Can you just explain
synesthesia?
that?
So apparently quite a lot of musicians actually are synesthetes. So, and it's where your kind of neurology gets crossed over, so you might hear colors or taste smells, or so it's one of your senses crosses over with another sense. So for Marcus, the way that it presents is that he hears sounds, and he didn't realize he was a synesthete until he was in his 20s, when he realized that the rest of the world doesn't hear that particular sound as pink, green, or whatever tone. So yeah,
it's a phenomenal painting. I love it. I mean, it's it's really, really incredible.
he's incredibly talented. The house is full. We frankly, he needs to move down to smaller canvases because we've run out of wall space. But that's a different.
I'll take some if you're running out of space, Beth, because I would love to have one of those on my wall. But it just goes to show, like, also I think I have heard of that like before, but maybe then put like 2 and 2 together, that actually falls under the umbrella. So even people who might know quite a lot about like neurodiversity, or like, you know, they work in it like day to day, like we learn new things every day.
Yeah, I only know it because I live with one, so, and I wouldn't be aware of it otherwise. So.
Yeah.
Pal, is there anything you want to add just in terms of these definitions, something you think that's important for us all to understand before we go into this conversation?
Yeah, I think there's usually quite a lot of like discussion and sometimes a bit of discourse about like the language that is used, and I can understand when it maybe affects people a little bit more like as an individual, but I think attempting to use like the right terms, I think, is definitely quite important. I will always maybe like respectfully like educate people that, you know, for example, we wouldn't use the term neurodiverse to refer to an individual, because like, I can't be like age diverse, for example, like I am my age, like that is it. So the term neurodiverse is for like a group of people with different neurotypes, both neurodivergent and neurotypical. So neurodiverse is like a collective. And then we would use neurodivergent for the individual. And then also neurodivergence when we're talking about it as, is that like an adjective? I think all of my GCSE English has gone out of my head right now. So if you're like saying that, like, oh, when you're disclosing your neurodivergence or your neurodivergent condition, but again, I know that these are like semantics, and even I get them mixed up sometimes. Another part which is probably kind of like class talked about is like person first or identity first language. So this tends to be like personal preference. So for, you know, people who are like autistic, they might prefer to say that I am an autistic person rather than a person with autism. And again, personal preference, because a lot of people do say that like this isn't like a disease or something that like you have and like you like carry, like it's an integral part of like you and how you work. So they are an autistic person instead of like a person with autism. So that's, I guess what I'd say in terms of like language.
Thank you, Parul. That's really helpful. And I think I'll probably get it wrong as well. So please forgive me if I did.
I got it wrong. I think when we first talked around neurodiversity, Parul, I think I originally wrote out some talking points, and then you corrected me and said, actually, this is neurodivergent. And then we've come to this, and then I think I got confused because I wrote the questions this time again. I'm sure I put it through Grammarly or ChatGPT, I can't remember, and it said neurodiverse was the right thing. So I was like, oh, maybe that was the right thing. And then obviously I said it to you, said, no, that's the wrong thing. You need to change it again. So it's
honestly,
it's
don't worry about it.
I do think the person first, or you know, the description first is a really important one as well. So in terms of whether, as you say, it's not a person with autism, it's potentially more likely to be an autistic person, and it really depends on how that person wants to be defined. And I think it's about that personal preference. I think that's really important. Thank you for that.
That's really, I think that really makes sense in terms of how we frame this and how people frame things for themselves. So I think that is absolutely important to learn how people will prefer to be referred to. If we move on to, I suppose, some of the, obviously there's lots of different areas we could go into, but some of the unique challenges that neurodivergent individuals might face in the workplace. Beth, do you want anything that stands out to you that maybe you've seen or maybe even experienced yourself?
So I think there are two obvious ones, and I think the first is probably that journey of self-learning that stands out for me. So it's interesting that sometimes I feel like neurodivergence can be described as it's almost like a static state, when in actual fact, as like any human being, hopefully we're on a journey of self-discovery, and going through that journey can be tiring and exhausting and enlightening, and so that in itself I think is quite a unique thing. So for me, for example, going through my diagnosis, knowing others that are going through diagnosis processes, who've had a diagnosis, who have rejected it, accepted it, and all our different feelings about that, that's a journey, and I think that can be difficult in the workplace. And then the most obvious one for me beyond that journey is around performance management. So I've already mentioned that 20% of the population could be defined as neurodiverse, and I think quite naturally within performance management we can find ourselves very easily in the bottom quartile or the top quartile when it comes to performance management. And I think very often it depends on the processes and the interpretation of a person's strengths and a viewpoint of their challenges or the things that they find harder by individual managers and by an organization. So I think fitting people who by definition are not on the scale of everyday normal into a performance management scale of everyday normal is either going to really work in their favor or really not work in their favor. And I've rarely ever been in the middle points. I'm either a high performer and underperformer. There's never been a difference, and that for me is something that I've come to see now through the lens of my difference in approaching the world.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that, actually, because there can, like, people could just like misinterpret neurodivergent traits for, like lack of like intelligence, lack of skills, lack of like capability to do a job, when in reality the barriers that they might actually face, which can have quite simple solutions sometimes, actually haven't actually been addressed, and then that can lead to, at the extreme end of like the spectrum is, like performance management, like a pit, and eventually, potentially losing like their job as well. There's an ONS report which shows that only 22% of autistic adults in the UK are in any form of employment. So that's not even like full-time employment. That's like people in like full-time, part-time, like temporary, freelance, internships. Of the entire adult population who are autistic, that figure to me, I think, is like, it's quite shocking.
That's really surprising. I wasn't aware of that. That's a pretty incredible figure, actually. Okay. And are there any other challenges, Parol, that we want to that kind of come up, or you see come up in the workplace at all?
I think something which has been really big for me on my journey over the last few years after my diagnosis has been self-advocacy. So self-advocacy, I think, is one of the most underrated skills you can actually develop in the workplace. And as somebody who has always been quite a bit of a people pleaser and always like compensators, the idea of advocating for myself was always quite scary. And I think that some people might think, okay, if you're having to advocate for yourself, then like it's not good. But the reality is, especially when I work, my job is like 95% remote. There can be like months where I don't go into the office, and people don't necessarily pick up on what you might actually be like struggling with, when it comes to like meetings, when it comes to communication and collaboration. So self-advocacy, to open up conversations about that and ask for what you need, and also make sure that it's also implemented as well, particularly if it is a reasonable adjustment, I think is a big barrier that I've had to overcome. And also unmasking. So for anybody listening who isn't sure what the term means, Becky, I might need you to add to this, actually. Masking is basically like it's like a survival like mechanism. So it's like how animals were like camouflage. So we were like camouflage and like mask our neurodivergent traits in order to fit in order to be accepted, in order to maybe like appear that we're good at our job, that we're like respectful. So that can be so many different things. Like I naturally mask a lot on meetings because I put so much effort into making sure that I look like I'm listening, which can actually impact my ability to listen. So that's probably, I think, like one of the things I sometimes like script before meetings like quite a lot as well. I used to write bullet points on little like sticky notes before I was going into like every meeting, even if it was literally like a 15-minute like chat as well. Beth, I don't know if you might have some more examples of masking.
So my best is that I am particularly inconsistent. So I can have days where I literally can't get anything done, and days where I'm working till 6 a.m, or I've done 2 solid days. And from a manager's perspective, that can be quite frightening to watch. So one of the ways that I mask that is lovely online presenteeism, and more broadly the fact that if I am writing emails at 3 a.m, I will stash them in my outbox and I press send at 9 a.m. So you can normally see when I've been having a hyper focus moment all night, because everybody gets emails at 9 a.m. So it's just little tips and things that I learned over the years to try and hide the fact that some days I literally can't switch my brain on, and some days I literally can't switch it off. And the average there is still above average, but I appreciate for other people to see that creates concern in managers, that level of inconsistency. So I've learned to mask that quite a lot.
Yeah, I think that probably ties into like the general theme of the reason why a lot of us might struggle in the workplace is because it's not always like built for us, whether that's actually like intentional or not. And a lot of the challenges that we come up against is because like we're just like basically trying to like fit in and meet these expectations of like, what does good communication look like what does good collaboration look like what does a good worker look like, what does a good line manager look like as well. And I think a really positive like movement that we're seeing now is that a lot of us, working in like HR, we're like talent or on a broader spectrum, are like, we're challenging what the norms are. Actually, we're challenging what does good look like. And I think there's a lot of work to do, but I think from my perspective it's been quite positive to see the strides that we've actually made in the last few years.
I think it's a really interesting way to put it, that the workplace hasn't necessarily been built for neurodivergent people. So Paola, what can companies do to best support employees who have been diagnosed with neurodivergent conditions? What are some of the things that you've seen worked or think will work?
So there's some things that we have actually done like internally, but what I would say is that I think there's like two distinct categories that these like actions or changes can actually like fall under. One is where the employee would take a little bit more ownership and like initiative, though I don't think the onus should always be entirely on them. And then the other one is more of like a top level, like there needs to be like an intrinsic change to the way that like organizations actually work, and that change has to come from often people that are in like the higher up like positions. So I think some of the big things is like getting neurodivergent people to actually like input on like feedback for different like internal processes. So myself and our neurodiversity champion, we got asked to basically give feedback on how we're communicating the new promotion process. So obviously we talked about the process itself as well, but they'd had some feedback from some neurodivergent people that the documentation of the new process was a bit confusing. So we sat and we went through like all of these different like areas, and then they actually went away and implemented it. So that's just one example. But if you're going into this blind and you're not actually getting input from the people that it's actually going to impact, you're probably missing a trick there. Another thing is the amount of flexibility in the work. So I'm not just talking about remote working and flexible hours as well, is flexibility on the scope of the role too. So I'm in a quite unique position where my role as recruitment marketing partner was a completely brand new role, which was, essentially carved out for me to actually like move into. So I've been able to pave that with the things that I'm really good at, that I enjoy, but then also overlap with the goals of the organisation as well.
We call that, I often call that job crafting, Carol. I don't know if you've ever heard about it, just job crafting. And it's that for everybody, that concept of, is there a way that we can structure someone's role that lets them use their talents to their best and not spend their days having their energy sucked by the stuff that, we all have to do a little bit of, but let's not make it a massive part of their job if it's not something they enjoy doing.
Oh, yeah, I like that. I'm gonna steal that as a little phrase, like job crafting. I think one of the other big things as well, I think, is like reasonable adjustments. And there's a lot of information on this, but I think the approach isn't necessarily nailed down in quite a lot of places. It can feel like quite transactional. So what is this that you need? Like, why do you need it? It can feel like the neurodivergent person is like really having to always make like a business case for it. They can feel like a bit of a burden. And let's say you go through like one round of it, and then your job scope like changes or your situation changes, and you need to have like a review. Like, going through that whole process again can be really, really like draining. And I know due diligence has to be done, but I think one thing that we've done really well is actually creating a really well-defined reasonable adjustments process, which is transparent on both sides, and there's documentation to support both the employee and also the line manager as well, who work together with their HR person and treat it more like an ongoing discussion. And we also talk about rules of engagement, so what happens after this discussion, and when the reviews will be as well. So there's very little left to like the imagination, so people know like what is a reasonable adjustment, what qualifies as it, and how are we actually going to support you to like put this into place. So yeah, that's one of like many things. Beth, is there anything else?
It's interesting you mentioning reasonable adjustments, because I think one of the things for me is about empowering managers to feel like they're able to just incorporate this stuff without even needing to go near reasonable adjustments. Like, why are we even having a reasonable adjustments conversation? Like, let's make it happen. Like, and creating that space for managers and the trust in managers to do a great job as well. So I think manager capability is it's my guiding light in business. Like, if your managers can't manage your business, is in trouble. And I think this is a really good example of it, empowering managers to be able to say, of course we can approach it this way. Of course you can bank hours in a, this way of banking hours works for you. So if I can think of one person in my business who has an illness that's unreliable, so at any given moment it might flare up for her, and so the way that we work for her is we've had a conversation about just banking hours. So when she's feeling well, she banks some extra hours and she can just run them off when she's not feeling so well, and it works perfectly. We didn't need to do that through a reasonable adjustments plan. So just helping managers understand that there's loads of ways they can do that without needing to go for the formal documents, because as you say, Pearl, the moment you get in there, you start going through HR processes and it can all get quite and unnecessary. And you're right that having to justify why this is important.
I'm interested to talk about, you mentioned HR process, so I'm interested to talk about policies in a second. Before I ask that, I'm interested to get both your take on, Powell, you mentioned kind of flexibility earlier on, and that was, I think you were focusing on the job crafting element, but of course the flexibility of how we do our work, I think, is quite an important thing. And at the moment, it's an ongoing thing, but at the moment we're seeing a big push from businesses. It doesn't seem like you've got this problem at X Design, absolutely not. But in general, in the UK and in Europe and the US, there seems to be a big push back to the office and a drive back. I wonder what you think in general. What's your opinion of this move back to how we were a few years ago and how that impacts neurodivergent talent?
Okay, I think it's a very bad move. I think there's no like one size fits all. I actually met one of my friends for coffee yesterday. She got her autism and ADHD diagnosis at the back end of like last year, actually, so it's like quite new to her. And she's like looking for a new job at the minute, which is why we started speaking. And she says that she actually wants to be somewhere with a local office in Manchester, because she actually quite likes the buzz of the office and having the structure, but also the flexibility. I'm the complete opposite. I'm happy to go in, but like I'm probably going to get like very little done because I will distract myself and everybody else like around me. I think businesses will like lose out on their talent. I think ultimately it has to come down to choice.
Yeah, I agree. Beth, anything on the return to office debates?
This is quite a live conversation in my business at the minute, because we're having a conversation about location strategy generally and accessing talent, something you and I were chatting about the other day, Paul. And I think, we do, as an organisation, we do want to have locations that gives us access to talent, but I also don't want to disengage the right people from the organisation. So it's, for me, what I want to avoid is hard and fast rules and just kind of terms of engagement. Like, these are our intentions. And that's our kind of preferences, as opposed to thou shalt be in the office 2 days a week. And frankly, because that won't work for me either, because like Pearl, like I like being in the office. I enjoy being around people and I like the energy of it. But I can guarantee you I'm going to get no work done, and I'll be exhausted from masking all day as well. So my chances of getting any work done on those days when I'm in the office are slim. And similarly, for people who work in different ways or communicate in different ways, being around people can be exhausting or too energizing. But at the same time, I do think it's important that we get together and we do find ways to collaborate. So we've had a really interesting discussion in the business this last couple of weeks about, are there other tools we can find to collaborate more often rather than forcing everybody into an office? Because it's not my preference to stick everybody on a train, but we do know when we have those days together that we can get through stuff and make decisions that would have taken months to make otherwise. So how do we get that balance of the good stuff without the bad stuff? And it's a really live conversation in our business right now. And I think we need to take the benefits that we've gained without and not lose them. At the same time as accepting that there are some things that we've lost, and how do we put them back? And I think we're smarter than forcing everybody in an office to put those back.
Yeah, agreed. I absolutely agree. Beth, moving back to, I suppose you mentioned HR policies earlier on. So for people with neurodivergent conditions, policies around disclosure can be a sensitive and sometimes uncomfortable issue. So how can companies get this right and ensure that they have a clear and supportive policy around it?
Yeah, and I think that disclosure is really frightening. So, you know, I'm relatively senior and I got my diagnosis 2 years ago, and I'm still coming to terms with articulating it properly in my professional persona, because I still worry about the way that I'll be interpreted as a result of it. And once you go there, you can't go back. You know, once you've put that post out there, you can't remove it. It's part of your people's interpretation of you. So I think too many businesses assume that because in the interview process someone didn't disclose neurodiversity, then they can move away from that kind of concept. And it is more complicated than that. That disclosure can happen slowly. That disclosure is frightening in itself, and that information has to be respected and protected at all times, like the integrity of that information. So I may have told one person in the business that I have ADHD, and I may have told someone else in the business, that I'm neurodivergent, but not wanted to go that far into the conversation. And that level of respect within those conversations is absolutely paramount, because you can't come back from it. For me, I think it's really important that I've seen situations where I believe I have someone in the team who has neurodiversity characteristics, and yet I don't necessarily have a diagnosis. They've not disclosed to me. And so for me, I tend to focus on characteristics rather than diagnosis, even if someone has about characteristics. So this person struggles with these situations, this person really shines in these situations, and you can have that conversation without going anywhere near disclosure or a diagnosis or anything like that. And frankly, we should be doing that for everybody, not
I
just
love that.
Characteristics.
I love that. I'm so glad that you said it, because we're having this conversation. There was it was like a small networking event for neurodiversity in engineering, like leadership. So it was actually quite interesting, because it was quite an interactive event. So we got different like perspectives, and some of the things which we were discussing was like, how do you like support people, if they haven't like disclosed? And do you know what? Sometimes we have a bit of a neurodiversity radar, so we can be like, okay, you're neurospicy, I think you are, which is the term that I like to use, by the way. So sometimes like you might spot it, but they might not even necessarily like know themselves. Like when I got my diagnosis, people were like, yeah, I could have told you that. I'm like, well, why didn't you tell me that? But again, obviously you don't want to go down that like avenue, but focusing on like supporting individuals without having to. So this is I want to ask you about this. So labels, good or bad or both?
Tricky. Yeah. Oh. So yeah, both. So I don't know. In my experience, I think I found that the label has helped me. It's a lens through which to see things. I find labels are a useful lens, but I also think that they can be dangerous because they can come with assumptions. So, our unconscious biases are real. And I'm still fighting my unconscious biases around neurodiversity, let alone, the rest of the planet. So I think, they're a useful lens, but they shouldn't be seen as a descriptor of a beautifully complex human being, because we are all beautifully complex. It's a map, it's a map. It's not the real photo. It's not the real place.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think moving the discussion away from like the labels in this case, I think is quite helpful. And I think understanding a team dynamic and how like different people work as well, especially when you're remote, it becomes a conscious effort rather than something that like you just kind of throw people like together, bring new people into the team, and like people might pick things up if they're spending all day in the office. But you start bringing like new people into a team and everybody's like working remotely, and you've not like understood how like different like people work. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it was doing the rounds on social media a few years ago. Monzo they had a working with me like document. So it's a bit like a read me file, if there's any techies like reading this. So basically it's like a manual for me, like how do I prefer to like communicate? So for example, please do not ask me to jump on a call with like no prior like notice about something which is like really like important for you. If it's not urgent like for me. Like put some time in, put some information in there. I can be a bit like, well, not overwhelming, but I can sometimes put stuff on different Slack messages and I don't realize that it's pinging a lot on the other person's side. So, you know, if I do tend to do that, like just basically like let me know. So I think like moving away from the labels and actually just helping people work better together is probably a better approach.
Yeah.
I struggle with the labels personally. Having a loved one who has been pre-diagnosed with ADHD, pre-diagnosed because there's a 2-year waiting list to get diagnosed, but they're treating them as if that's what the situation is. I feel like with labels, I feel like society just likes to put people in boxes, and it just makes them more comfortable to say, right, everyone's got this. But with something like, for me, this is just my opinion, for something like ADHD, for example, I think it's really difficult to say, if I've got ADHD, that may be very, very different to someone next to me who's got it. So I think it's quite, for me, I find the labeling thing quite dangerous.
Yeah. And I think that to focus on ADHD a little in this conversation, I think, you know, we all present differently. And I think the most obvious version of that is between men and women and the way men and women present ADHD. And in actual fact, any neurodiversity I can think of, even just, you know, the cultural influences of growing up a guy or growing up a girl absolutely changes the way we present. And so I think assumptions around that are actually probably the reason why it took me, you know, 30 odd years to finally get a diagnosis, because everyone assumed that I wasn't throwing chairs around the room and I wasn't impossible to teach, therefore I couldn't possibly have ADHD. And it's, you know, because the label has a certain interpretation, and that's one of the reasons why I've struggled to interpret that label, because I kind of almost need to clear the path. I need the world to see that the label is not the entire thing, as you say, Paul, because that box, when you put it, it's very hard to climb out of it. Carol, I don't know if you've had the same experience of receiving a label.
Yeah, I think so. I think it goes for like a lot of the different conditions, but for me personally with ADHD, because I am predominantly inattentive. So again, just for context, there's 3 types of ADHD: hyperactive, / impulsive. So that's kind of what we perceive as like naughty boy in the classroom. The second type is inattentive. And then the third type is combined type. So I am combined type, but heavily inattentive. So a lot of my like symptoms or like traits of ADHD are internalized. And a lot of people who I tell would say that, like, do you know what, I actually wouldn't even notice, but because you can only see like this part of me, and I'm not like, I'm keeping eye contact, etc. What you literally can't see is I'm actually fidgeting with like my nails and the skin around like my fingers. So even right here, you can't even like see that part of me that I'm actually doing like right now, which is that kind of like impulsive part of like the ADHD and like needing to do something like with my hands. So when people, it's dangerous when people then start to make assumptions about like what you're good at and what you're actually not good at, because I've had to overcompensate for most of my life. I'm actually very good at things like processes, documentation, organization, like workflows, all that kind of stuff. So once people actually realize that they can leverage those skills, they're like, oh my gosh, you're actually like really good at this. I'm like, honestly, you would be surprised. And because now it comes as second nature to be like, I'm not like this disorganized, like forgetful ADHD that people maybe expect me to be. So that's like, I mean, it's quite sad really that people come to me with that kind of preconception of like how I actually am as a person.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting point. Lots of people that I've talked about around neurodiversity or who are neurodivergent often talk about the fact that the world sees them in a certain way because of their label, and actually sometimes they have to ham up, almost ham up the other things, like being ridiculously obviously organized in a way that helps everybody can see it, because you don't really want to wear a badge that says I've got ADHD and I am actually organized, or I'm on the autistic spectrum and yet I'm brilliant with people. You don't feel that it's so there's a hamming up that sometimes happens around things. And also I think one of the things that I found around personally my diagnosis, and I know other people have been through, is that the world wants my positive traits. But it feels like there's not a lot of room for the negative traits that come with it. That the world wants me to talk about my superpowers, but it's much harder when the world wants to hear me talk about the fact that literally I can't get any work done today because I cannot function. But it's all right, I'll do it at 4 a.m. because that's where my brain will fire up. So the world doesn't want to know those bits. It's like, so it becomes almost like an unbalancing of the bits. It's like a partial unmasking almost.
Yeah, and it's a package. You have to, like, you can't have like one side of it without like the other as well. So if you want the good attention to detail, spotting patterns, creativity, thinking outside of the box, working well under like pressure, which is obviously like a generalization, but if you want all of those things, you're gonna have to, like, you're gonna see the impact of like the what's called like the negative traits as well, and understanding that it is a balance.
Powell, we've got a request going back to one of your comments earlier on. They've asked, Kate Wilkinson said, would you feel comfortable sharing that guidance on reasonable adjustments?
So this is something which we are just like finalizing at the moment. So like some people have actually started using it. I would have to speak to our people partner, because I think some of it will be X design specific, but I think she's always up for like helping other people. So if there's a case where we can maybe like edit it a little bit and take some parts and then actually like release that, there might be something I might do in like a newsletter article, but feel free to add me on LinkedIn. It's not my decision to make, but if I can do, I will do in the future.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Powell. Powell, earlier on you mentioned as well, and I know you do this of course, is that that you do mentoring, and I think that coaching and mentoring can be incredibly beneficial for neurodivergent conditions. So what's some best practices around coaching and mentoring support in the workplace for this?
I think there's different types of coaching and mentoring. I think the obvious one is like from your line manager. So it's something which I didn't realize that a lot of people don't know about, the access to work like grant from the government. Beth, I don't know if you've kind of like, have you gone through it yourself?
I haven't gone through it myself. I've pointed quite a few people at it though.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to find out more about this, just like a quick Google, give you some information. But essentially, it is a government grant for anybody with a disability or a mental health condition to support them with work. And this also includes self-employed people as well, I believe, which is great. So I went through that process and I got my grant. And the two best things which I've been given off that are actually ADHD coaching and ADHD co-coaching. So I'll talk about like the coaching a little bit first. So I've actually almost done my 20 hours. And the first thing I would say is I actually requested to have a coach who has ADHD. And there are people who can coach on these things, but my personal preference was to have somebody with the lived experience who I think could, you know, maybe understand where I'm actually like coming from and not try and have a bit of a neurotypical approach with things. And I think this has been like, you know, out of like therapy, like CBT, anything else has been the biggest game changer to change my outlook. And a lot of the times it's actually pressure that I put on myself as well. I was amazed how like literally within a few sessions I felt like she knew me better than I actually knew myself. And the way that like we've tackled some of my challenges at work have been absolutely incredible. So that kind of specialized coaching from somebody who just gets it, I think is like probably one of the best things that I've done. And then the co-coaching, which is a bit interesting. So we've only done a few sessions on this, but it's effectively coaching. I do have the same coach for it, which was actually quite good because she already gets me. But it's with you and your line manager to help them understand you better. Like obviously kind of like the general perspective, like the like condition, but also like you specifically, so how it impacts you, how that might show up at like work as well. And then some of the like not advising on like reasonable adjustments, etc., but sometimes even just like getting that, like if I do these things or like I ask for this, I know I need reassurance on this, or you know, if you don't understand where I'm coming from, that this is actually why. So I think that's been like really, really helpful for me. But then I do also have like a bit of like an informal buddy as well. So Johnny, who's the neurodiversity like champion, so he works on the neurodiversity stuff internally with me. Sometimes if I'm just struggling to untangle my own thoughts, or you know, I just need to speak to somebody who gets how like my brain works, I just have a chat with him. He doesn't help me with like, you know, the operational stuff and how to tackle things on my projects because he doesn't work in marketing. But I think actually a buddy system for any kind of like ERG, which is employee like resource group, I think is really, really valuable, because it kind of like alleviates some of that like pressure on like line managers, which obviously in some cases is important, I think. But you know, a buddy is not a mentor, they're not a coach, they are just like peer-to-peer support. So I think having access to different kinds of support, I think is probably been the most beneficial thing for me and other people as well.
Beth, any thoughts on the coaching and mentoring?
Yeah, so about 300, obviously. So I think what's really interesting is, you know, since the pandemic, since, you know, the majority of us are home workers, I think this is a much bigger issue now, that we need to be more formulaic and more supportive of people in these processes, especially people who are joining the workforce or joining the organisation for the first time. So if you've been in the business since 2017 and you already had that network of support around you and you knew those people, it's quite easy to take that home with you. But if you're new to the business or you're new to the workforce and you just don't have that around your career, or, you know, in various different ways that you will find those buddies and those coaches and those mentors in an informal way, then we have to create those formal networks that will create it. Because that, again, we go back to going back to the office thing. That's that thing. That's one of the values that I think we've lost, because we are all at home. We don't have those opportunities to just bump into people and realize that they get us and we get them and we can help each other. So creating opportunities for people to build formal, if you like, relationships. And by formal, I don't necessarily mean everything's documented, like let's not go mad, we don't need policy for it, but definitely there's some skills, there's some support, people understand some expectations, and there's some kind of, you know, thoroughness to the conversations. And I think that runs at different levels. Parol, you made a really good point about conversations with managers as well. And I think someone in the business needs to accept responsibility for that, whether it's an external coach that's going to support, or whether that's HR, or who that is in the business, I don't know, whether it's the ops director, whoever, but someone needs to facilitate that conversation, because it's a very frightening conversation for someone who's neurodiverse to sit in front of the person who is making a judgment on their performance, to say, for example, I don't know, I really struggle when you send me a really, really long email, could you just make sure there's no more than 10 bullet points, for example? Or sometimes I'll freeze on a task and it looks blatantly obvious to you what I need to do, but I can't find that answer, and I need you to just come, unfreeze me and do that shame-free and let me get on with my job. And that's a really frightening conversation to have, because you're asking for something. And I think someone needs to accept responsibility for enabling that conversation. I come back to that. Line managers having the right level of support to be able to do that properly. So whether that's a coach or a mentor or a buddy, I don't really mind, as long as someone is doing that within the business. I think is incredibly important.
I think managers absolutely need help and support. I think we've learned so much in the last 5 to 10 years. I mean, just overall, what a manager looks like in terms of how they operate and how they treat people and how they deal with people and how they work with different people in teams. We've come so far in 10 years, but it's moved really quickly. So it's not necessarily the manager's fault if they haven't got all the understanding. So I think you're right. I think it probably is, you know, there does need to be somebody who's kind of taking ownership of making sure managers are up to speed and have had all the relevant training. Do you think, is that an HR responsibility, do you think, Beth?
I think I always feel for line managers, because I feel like there's so many expectations on them, you know, to have great stakeholder relationships, run a great operation and make sure all their people are happy. Like, oh my God, like bring me another expectation if you like. Like that's so much to do at the same time as being a technical expert and having loads to do. So I think I can't think of another job where people get asked to do it without any training whatsoever. I'd never ask someone to fly an airplane without any training, and yet they're asked to run a whole team or a whole function without any formal support in understanding how to be a great manager. So for me, I think manager networks are really, really important. So it's a learned capability. It's not something you can learn from a book. It's like driving a car. You're not going to learn to drive a car from reading it. You're going to learn to drive a car by being out on the road, which means you're going to make mistakes, which means you need a network. And I think that building those professional networks within organizations and making sure that this is part of the conversation and making sure that those individuals are supported with whatever's going on in their team. So yes, I think formal learning is important. I think informal learning is more important, as long as it's not informal learning in replacement of any kind of whatsoever, i.e. get out there and and go crash the car kind of approach.
That's a very good point. I think there's two sides to that though. I think in some situations, like learning on the job, like the stakes can be like quite high, especially when there's a neurodivergent line report who is like in the middle of all of that. And if the expectations aren't set, if the trust isn't built for them to actually talk about what their needs are and what they actually need in terms of support in the workplace, and that's inevitably gonna lead to attrition. I think like we talk about getting neurodivergent people into like the workplace, but then I think the retention is like equally important as well.
Yeah, and similarly, destroy that manager's confidence and destroy that neurodivergent person's, that destroy everybody's confidence in that process, like without providing the support.
Yeah, I think actually part of that is probably knowing what the escalation point is. So a new manager's especially aware of the point where like they've like done everything that they can, they've exhausted all of like the avenues, and this is now an escalation point to either like HR or like somebody else, because they can't solve everybody's problems at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the we are talking quite a bit about, I suppose, the retention side of things, but in terms of the attraction, Parallel, what can businesses do around hiring processes to make sure they're kind of fit for purpose, I suppose, for neurodivergent candidates?
Oh, this is it's a big topic. There's a few areas. There's the application process and adverts. There's the actual like interview. So how do they like communicate and asking questions? Types of interviews, the assessment and like selection as well. So what are people actually getting marked up or like marked down on, and the reasonable like adjustments. But I think one of the big things I wanted to mention here is like the actual interviews themselves. So you've got like in-person interviews and like remote interviews. You have like competency-based interviews. Some companies do one-way interviews, which is absolutely horrifying to me, to probably most people, to sit there in front of a camera. Some of them actually do it. It's like timed, and you only get one attempt. So they'll like ask you a question, you record yourself answering that question, and once you're done, like that's it, like it's gone. There's no like recording it or anything, which I think a lot of these are quite inaccessible to a lot of like people, not just neurodivergent people. But one in particular, which like particularly irks me, is psychometric testing. So a lot of this, like, and again, probably quite controversial opinion, I think a lot of this is actually based on like pseudoscience. And if we look at like personality testing, like particular, so one example which we might have heard of is like the Myers-Briggs type like indicator. These can actually be a pass or fail scenario. So somebody actually messaged me on LinkedIn, and she wanted some advice on something because she'd applied for a tech role for a very well-known like shop, e-commerce, not e-commerce. So basically like a large business that we probably all like shopped at. And she said the first stage of the process was a psychometric test. And she's autistic. And one of the questions she was asked, I've actually copy pasted this from the message if I remember. So one of the questions asked was whether you would get to know people by asking about them personally or about their job role. How does this show how well I can do my job? I'm terrible at small talk and would likely ask about their job rather than their personal life. It's rather exclusive in that reason because, for example, like autistic people will, might struggle to like read between the lines. They might take things quite literally. They're like, well, why wouldn't you ask them about this? Because that seems like logical to me. Or maybe in like a social like setting, what is like socially acceptable, it might be something which is like completely different. So firstly, I don't think psychometric tests should be included at all. I think they should like straight in the bin. And if they have to be, absolutely not the first stage of the process. So you're filtering people out before you even speak to them.
Yeah. And I have quite a strong opinion on psychometrics, which is, so I am actually a Myers-Briggs profiler. So I use MBTI regularly, but I don't disagree with your perspective, Parallel, but it should never be used as a recruitment tool. It's absolutely clear when you're signed off as a profiler and you sign that form that says, I will use this responsibly. One of the responsibilities is never use it for interviewing because it's far too blunt a tool to identify again, you're putting people into 16 boxes and there are more than 16 people on the planet. So let's just accept that, again, it's nothing but a lens. So in the same way that a diagnosis is nothing but a lens, it's nothing but a lens, and it's a way to have a conversation about the things that you love and the things that you don't love, and nothing more than that. So I think I don't necessarily have a problem with psychometrics. I have a problem with their misuse.
Yes.
I think it's far too easy. They get given to people who don't understand them, and then they misuse them, and then they get a horrible name. So one of my greatest mentors is a positive psychologist, and he hates it because from his perspective, the moment you tell someone what they are, you tell them what they aren't, and that label becomes self-fulfilling. And I absolutely see his perspective, but I do think it's a useful tool. What I have found with Myers-Briggs, which I think is quite interesting, is I have tended to find that people who are neurotypical score quite clearly on them. People who are neurodiverse don't score well on them. So they normally, because it's a bell curve, they normally are at either end of the bell curve. So invariably, I have conversations with people that say, I don't see myself in this. And often that's because that relates to their neurodiversity. So I can categorically say from my experience, I don't think it works for neurodiverse people. I think there's a bell curve and it's nothing more. So, and I also similarly, I think I've been trained in, was it Pearson? I can't remember. So it was one of the long psychometric tools for talent identification. It's at the other end of the kind of telescope assessment. And I think these things can be useful as a mechanism, as one of a way to collect data in the recruitment process, but it's not your primary data point. I completely agree, Carl. So for me, really diverse hiring processes recognize that we're all going to shine in different ways and creates an opportunity for us to shine in all of those ways. So psychometrics, when stacked up against practical activities, when stacked up against, competency-based questions or whatever the assessment tools are, build you a rounded picture of that person. And it's not a screening out situation. So it would be really rare for me to ever consider that actually this person. For me, it's part of the round of an assessment, and it's not the be all and end all. And that's the problem. Misuse as a way to reduce that pile of CVs from 300 to 30, and that category is wrong.
So psychometric tests for interviews, we're putting that in the bin.
I think it's a tool, and I think it needs to be used responsibly as a tool and nothing more. And it's certainly not the be all and end all. So I think people are like, scientists came up with it, therefore it must be right. Back to your point, Sarah, that it feels like pseudoscience. It is based on science, but it's not.
Yes.
It's not a pH test. It's not going to turn green or red and tell you the exact answer because we're more complicated than that. So.
Absolutely. And Beth, stay with you actually for this next question. So I think having neurodivergent individuals in leadership positions can help the inclusive workplace culture overall. So how can companies make sure they're creating opportunities for neurodivergent individuals to advance within the organization so we get to that point?
Yeah, and I think that you can almost follow that thread all the way back to, are we fishing in the right pools to make sure that we're identifying, places where we can find neurodiverse talent? Are we engaging with that talent through the process? Are we then giving, putting that talent with managers who know how to get the best out of them? Are we performance managing them through processes? So all of those things, I think, are part of that thread of then creating an environment where neurodiversity is just seen as part of our great strength rather than a problem to be managed. So there was some interesting research done by Deloitte, I think it was 2018, and the evidence that they produced suggested that neurodiverse teams are 30% more productive and make fewer mistakes than a team of neurotypical people. It's some really interesting figures that suggest that it's not a nice to have. This isn't about doing the right thing for society. It's about doing the right thing for your business, So for me, that, a neurodiverse leadership team, by definition, if that was 30% more productive, dear God, think what the business could achieve. So it's a total no-brainer that it's something that needs to be created. But how is difficult. So I think sometimes it's luck, and sometimes it's survival. I'm quite lucky because my MD that I work with, whilst he isn't officially diagnosed as neurodiverse in any way, everybody in his family is, and he's quite an unusual character. So one day maybe it'll turn up, maybe it won't. But
it's genetic.
Yeah, he's comfortable with the concept of neurodiversity.
Okay.
And so me talking about my neurodiversity within the team has actually been a really easy thing because he's like, oh yeah, my dad's like that. Or it's become part of the conversation quite naturally. And similarly, it's something that we talk about within the leadership team, and it's something that we talk about within the business as well. So I'm quite happy to kind of talk about how I am, and that's created an environment where other people feel the ability to do the same. So quite a lot of people actually, increasingly feel able to have a conversation with me about that. And I hope we can carry on that conversation and make it a greater part of what we do. So in answer to your question, Paul, sorry, in my usual style, I think the point is you've got to get all the pieces right. Talent processes within businesses I find inherently problematic. So I've seen, especially leadership acceleration programs, which backfire considerably for the individual business. So you find yourself in a situation where someone's been expected to gain 15 years worth of experience in 2 years and now finds themselves in a very senior position and really struggling as a result of that. And so I struggle with talent acceleration programs. I come back to mentoring, good people management, and performance management processes, which don't tell your best people that they need to be more organized or they need to be gentle, whatever the thing is that is. I think it was 9 Lies About Work. I think it was Marcus Buckingham and I can't remember who the other person was. They wrote a really interesting book called 9 Lies. If you've not heard of it, I can absolutely, and even just finding a synopsis online. And one of the things that they discovered, Goodall, their name was Goodall. One of the things they discovered was that by definition, your best people are spiky. They're not well-rounded. Your highest performers are going to be those people that have got a couple of magnificent strengths that you need to encourage the value from, as opposed to continuously tell them that they're a 2 out of 10 on this scale. And so ditching telling those individuals to become well-rounded and building a situation where we talk about our strengths and how do we use them. Don't get me wrong, we need to remove limiting factors. If your disorganization is such that it's, a really big problem for everybody, we need to do something about it. But once we've moved past that, let's get past it and get on to how do we use strengths. So strengths-based performance management, I think, is key. So there's a website called Strengths Finder or High Five Test, which I think is pretty cool. Some really interesting things out there that help people articulate what are their strengths and how do we get value from them. So I think good performance management, I come back to it all the time.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to save that website. I was just going to ask you, because this actually came up on, probably good for both of you actually, it came up on a panel that was on a few months ago about, is a more structured progression pathway, or was it promotion criteria, etc. Is more structured actually a good thing, because it means that people actually know what they need to kind of do, what skills they need to demonstrate, or does it veer into the danger of it being too prescriptive and putting people into a box? What do you both think?
I'm sitting back waiting for Paul.
No, go on, Beth. Go on, please. Go on.
I think with any choice you make, there are pros and cons, and you need to understand the pros and cons of that choice. So less structured is going to encourage people to shine potentially, but it also runs the risk of people being overlooked. Whereas more structured, you've got less chance of overlooking people, but you've also got more chance of putting people in boxes and forcing expectations on them before they're ready. So I just think you need to manage the outcomes of either one of those decisions.
Yeah.
Political answer.
I agree with you. I think I've just got to. I really dislike putting people in boxes. I really don't like anything which does that. And I suppose it's easy for me to say, but I think I'm the more pragmatic part of me would probably say I agree with what you're saying, Beth. Final question. So we're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes. It's been really good. We've got through so much. I didn't think we'd get through as much as we have, which has been great. So final question, Beth, for businesses who are looking to just get better at creating this type of environment, which is a better one for neurodivergent people, what's some good places for them to, where can they go and learn? Where can they go and where's some good reference points for them? And Powell, I'm going to ask you in a second the same thing for individuals. So you have a think about that for a sec. Beth, in terms of the company, what would you recommend?
So I think in terms of what to look for, I've already mentioned Buckingham and Goodall, so 9 Lies About Work. I think it's a really interesting lens to lay over this around our expectations of what a traditional organisation should look like. More broadly, I think there are some amazing networks and sources of information out there. They're too valuable to list, if I'm really honest. Too voluminous to list. But I would definitely, there are some interesting books out. I've forgotten the name of it. Forgive me, Paul. I point you towards 9 Lies as my starting point in any of that.
Perfect, thank you, Beth.
Right.
And then same to you, Powell, but for the individual who's looking to learn more, maybe about themselves or the people they're working with, what would you recommend?
I think that is a very big list of things. And
Yeah.
fortunately for you, I've compiled them all into one resource bank on a Notion page, which is, if you head over to my LinkedIn profile and click the link at the top, which will take you to my link tree, and you can find it on there. So it does actually have resources for like hiring managers and line managers as well, but a lot of it is focused on like the individuals for self-advocacy in like the workplace, knowing what kinds of like grants and other things that are actually available for them as well. And so I think stuff like that. One thing that's been really helpful for me specifically is the Adult ADHD UK Discord group as well. So I found them from the podcast that they do, which is absolutely brilliant. And then I came across like the Discord channel, which if people haven't used it before, it's quite similar to Slack actually, and that's also been like a really good like supportive like source and like resources as well. I think the more you look, it's a little bit easier to sort of like find. But I spent two years just kind of like fumbling in the dark. So the reason I wanted to pull those together is to help people who maybe don't know where to start, and you can reach out to me if you have any questions.
It's almost like I knew you had that list, isn't it? There you
Isn't
go.
it?
Fantastic. Look, thank you so much, you two. I've really enjoyed that. I'm sure listeners have as well. Everyone who's listening, either live or on the podcast catch up, thank you for tuning in. Next week, we're talking about how to create and succeed with a remote first culture. I am, of course, not for pushing people back to the office. So I'm much more in favor of a balanced working environment. And I think these companies, I've got 3 people from 3 great companies who are going to talk us through exactly how to make it work a fully remote culture. So do tune in for that. But Beth, Parul, thank you so much for being a part of this Talent and Growth webinar. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.